Hello and welcome back to Chronicled, the History of Newcastle United. I'm Matt Ketchell, the North East Football App and Engagement Editor here at Chronicle Live. And this is episode 5 of our walk through the history of Newcastle United. Last week we covered 1898 to 1905. Newcastle went from promotion newbies to the best team in the country, all in the space of 7 years. But the campaign ended in disappointment with a defeat in the showpiece of the season, the FA Cup final. Today for episode 5, we're covering 1905 to 1910, a 5-year period that, as you're about to discover, is the most successful spell, probably, in the club's history. To talk us through these glory years, I'm joined by Paul Joannou, Newcastle United's official club historian, the ultimate expert in Newcastle United history. The club have only won the league 4 times in their history, and in this episode we get to talk about 3 of those victories. Paul, in 1905-1906 then, Newcastle's attempt to defend their league title saw them finish 4th, but they made the FA Cup final for the second year running. Do you think there was more attention spent on the cup run than the league?
Well, a pattern seemed to develop in this era. I don't think it was by design, but it was the League one season and then the FA Cup the next season. That seemed to be the way of things, and that certainly occurred over the next 5 or 6 seasons. And in 1905-06, while the champions did well in league action, as you say, finishing 4th, attention was on the FA Cup once more. And they made another visit to the Crystal Palace, the romp to the final this time in a very convincing manner, and were hot favourites to lift the trophy this time. Back then it was called the English Cup rather than the FA Cup. They faced Everton, and they were big rivals to Newcastle United during much of the decade. But Newcastle again flopped at the Crystal Palace in front of the vast glass arena, and they lost by a single goal.
And this was pre-Wembley Stadium, so showcase games were taking place in Sydenham, South London, in the shadow of the famous Crystal Palace arena, as you said. Newcastle fans and players, they must have felt cursed playing there. They never won.
No, that's right. The Palace jinx was very strange. United played there 5 times in the years before World War One and never won a game. While he also faced the club Crystal Palace in the FA Cup during 1908, and they lost 1-0 at St James's Park, and that was a huge shock. But at the Palace arena, some said that the grass at Sydenham was far too long for their neat possession style of football. Others said they were too nervous on the occasion, and it became very bizarre.
I see. It's worth explaining that this isn't Selhurst Park that we're talking about, where Crystal Palace play today. This was a stadium at Sydenham Hill in the same grounds as a giant glass and iron exhibition hall that originally stood in Hyde Park that housed the Great Exhibition of 1851. The structure was then taken down and rebuilt between 1852 and 54 at Sydenham Hill, which is now in the borough of Bromley, and it survived there until 1936. And 1905 is actually the year that Crystal Palace formed, and they actually did play there in their early years until the outbreak of World War One. But back to the northeast, Newcastle, they were making huge strides with their own facilities at St James's Park, weren't they, Paul?
Well, yeah, in the summer of 1905, St James's Park underwent a huge enlargement project with money flowing into the United Bank. The Victorian stand was demolished and a much larger main stand erected to be known as the West Stand for decades to come. It also had a bird's eye press box like the 1890s version to be known as, and that was equally as dramatic as the original one, but much higher. The other 3 sides of the ground were all enlarged, which with much bigger bank terracing. Capacity was substantially increased from 30,000 to 60,000, although more came through the turnstiles. It was opened against Manchester City as the 1905-06 season started, and few clubs in the country could boast a larger arena, and it was much heralded at the time.
Amazing. So one of the best teams in the country, and probably one of the best stadiums in the country as well at that time. After 1905-06 then, a season that didn't bring any trophies, it was into this new campaign What do you think the focus might have been, the league or the cup?
Well, in Newcastle's way, it was back to the league. Although, as I said before, it certainly wasn't planned that way. I'm sure of that. They started the season in quite a dramatic way, in so much that a new record crowd was recorded at St James's Park. 56,876 were there on the opening day of the season against neighbour Sunderland, and it was a pretty hot day. Recorded as 90-degree heat. United won 4-2, and after that, the Magpies were dominant all season in league action and secured the second championship trophy.
Brilliant. 56,000 against Sunderland in 90-degree heat. I bet that was a lively one. We should mention the FA Cup campaign for this season as well. The Crystal Palace curse, you mentioned it earlier. It struck again, but this time it wasn't on Tyneside. It was was on Tyneside rather than in London. Yeah,
Crystal Palace were then in the Southern League. They hadn't joined the Football League and only formed in 1905, so a pretty young club. It was in the FA Cup first round, equivalent to the third round now. And Palace had a side full of Northeasterners. They were managed by a Northeasterner, and one or two ex-Newcastle reserve players were in the side. And they won and caused all sorts of headlines. They won 1-0 at Gallowgate, and it was a huge shock.
Yeah, that's amazing. I didn't realise that there was some exile Geordies in the team either, which must have made it extra sore for the losing Newcastle team at the time. So after dominating the league, surely 1907-08 was the year that the club finally buried their FA Cup curse, was it?
Well, you would think it should have been. It was certainly back to the FA Cup for that season, 1907-08. They reached the final in resounding manner, scoring all of 18 goals in the process, including a 6-0 victory in the semi-final over Fulham. And that's still a record for that stage in the competition even today. They were even more hot favourites this time as Newcastle faced second division Wolves. But yet again, the Palace Gremlin played its part, unfortunately. Newcastle never got going and were defeated 3-1. And that was even a bigger shock than the Crystal Palace defeat.
Wow, yeah, I can imagine. And something interesting happened to one of Newcastle's official photographers at the time. On his way back from covering the 1908 Cup final, he would have been disappointed to see Newcastle lose. But a snapper called Gladstone Adams, who was born in Byker and had a studio on Station Road in Whitley Bay, he kind of invented the window wiper on a car, didn't he?
Well, yes. Many Newcastle supporters at that time got used to travelling to London, usually by train. A few went down the North Sea by boat. There was a steamer run from Newcastle to the Thames, and also by car. But that was a pretty rare occurrence. And Gladstone Adams did that. He drove from Tyneside in his car all the way to London. And remember, there was no motorways and very few good trunk roads either. So it was quite a trek to get to London. And he, on his way back, apparently, as the story goes, it was raining, snowing, and he had great difficulty seeing where he was going. So he came up with an idea of some sort of windscreen wiper contraption, which he put together, and that certainly helped him getting back to Tyneside. And 2 or 3 years later, he patented that design, but it was never manufactured. However, his original prototype can be seen in the Discovery Museum in Newcastle. He was quite a character, Adams, he became a very well-known and famous photographer and publisher of postcards in the Northeast, which are very much collected these days. And he was the club's official photographer in 2 spells, from 1911 to 1929 and 1951 to around about 1960. He was one of 3 very well-known Tyneside photographers associated with the club.
Brilliant excuse to go and visit the Discovery Museum in Newcastle and check out his prototype when time allows. I think I'll have to do that. So Newcastle were clearly one of the best teams in the country. That was reflected in the crowds at the newly improved St James's Park and in the players that were starting to arrive to play for Newcastle as well.
Yeah, there was certainly the big games at Gallowgate now attracted excellent crowds, and the club became one of the richest in the country. They were very prosperous, and as a result, more top players arrived on Tyneside. The purchased Scottish international Finlay Speedy and the record signing of George Wilson from Everton, and he cost £1,600. He was another Scottish international and a top quality winger who could score and make goals. So they had Wilson on one side and Jackie Rutherford on the other, and they were quite a potent force. And while both of them were Scots, it's got to be said, back then in the 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, Scottish footballers were really top class. There was dozens and dozens of them in the English game.
So let's talk about the third league championship win in the 5-year period that we're covering this week. 1908-1909 remains the most convincing league campaign in the history of the club, doesn't it?
Yes, it was a monumental season for the club, for Newcastle. This was probably the season that they really reached the pinnacle of their Edwardian masters supremacy. They were crowned league champions for the third time in 5 seasons, and this time by a record haul of points. Newcastle had a new centre forward that year too. They went into the transfer market again and splashed out for the England leader Albert Shepherd, and he was a huge character. He replaced Bill Appleyard, who had was getting on a bit and was a huge success. Also to arrive was another England international forward, an exiled Geordie called James Stewart, and he was a very talented schemer. And the club now had a squad full of international players, probably the strongest they've ever had in over 100 years.
Wow. So tell us a bit about Albert Shepherd. He was one of the great Newcastle centre forwards in a long line that was about to follow. Yes,
well, he, as I say, was a huge character. He was capped by England, signed from Bolton Wanderers. He was a very exciting centre forward, famed for his dashes through the middle, ending in a rocket shot, I suppose, a bit like Malcolm MacDonald many years later. He got into all sorts of incidents. Once he agreed with the club officials and the referee, for that matter, that if he scored a hat-trick when he was playing away at Notts County, he could leave the field early to catch a train because he had an evening function back in Newcastle, and he wanted to make sure he got there. And of course, Albert scored 3. Newcastle were well ahead, and he left about 10 minutes early. Just simply walked off the pitch after just telling the ref and his players that he was away now. And he was such a character. He scored an amazing 92 goals in only 123 appearances for the club before injury wrecked his career.
Amazing. Love that story about Albert. Sounds like a right character. So even though Newcastle were convincing league winners in this 1908-1909 season, there was a bit of a curious result in the Tyne-Wear derby in December 1908, wasn't there?
Well, there certainly was. That title season also saw the quite remarkable 9-1 defeat at St James's Park by rival Sunderland. The date, and everybody should remember it, the 5th of December 1908. Albert Shepherd had just been signed, and at that point in the season, there was a bit of a player-director squabble. Various star players had fallen out over an issue, and they were demoted from the first team, and the directors picked several reserves. They won at Nottingham Forest in the game before the derby, and the committee decided to retain the same side. But Newcastle paid the price, the biggest hammering by their local rivals ever. and never before had the champions-elect lost so heavily on home turf in a season. It was only 1-1 at half-time, with Albert Shepherd striking a home debut penalty. But United fell behind. They were down to 9 men at one stage through injury, and were totally overwhelmed in the second half. Sunderland hit 8 goals. It was a remarkable day.
Yeah, it sounds like it. The 5th of December, 1908, a dark day in the history of Newcastle United. Was that a kick up the backside for the team then? The thought of losing 9-1 at home to Sunderland is pretty dreadful.
Yes, it must have been. Certainly the reports and the player memoirs that I've read from the likes of Colin Veitch and Peter McWilliam all said that the players were absolutely determined to do something about it. And the club directors and players met, and they patched up the differences. The big stars were back for the following game, and the defeat spurred United on. For the rest of the season, they were absolutely magnificent, and Albert Shepherd fitted in perfectly, and they went on a wonderful run, winning 14 of the next 18 games, including 7 in a row, and they were champions and recognised as the best side in the land. They were quite sensational after that Sunderland defeat. So we can thank Sunderland for something. We can probably thank them for winning the title that season.
Yeah, amazing turnaround. Newcastle, the best team in the land. That feels like a good note to end this episode on. But I'm going to flash a bit of bonus content up on the screen for people watching on video or on our YouTube channel. There was one more star of the team that we haven't discussed from this era, and that is this guy, Rex. There's a picture of a dog now on our screen. Quite a canine Rex looks like, Paul. Can you describe this guy and who he was and how he's associated with Newcastle United?
Yeah, well, Frank Watt, the club's secretary and leading administrator, liked his dogs. One very early group before the turn of the century shows a long, hairy, 4-legged friend. Then Rex came along in March 1909. He was gifted to the club by a close supporter. Rex was a large Great Dane, black and white, of course, and he became the club's mascot and very much liked by officials and all the players. Colin Veitch interestingly relates in his memoirs that Rex was on a regular basis tied up on the side of the pitch near the tunnel for home matches. And once when United scored, the crowd's roar startled the dog. He broke free and ran all over the pitch, barking like mad. Afterwards, unfortunately, poor old Rex was banned from attending future games. No. But nevertheless, he was a mascot, and he can be seen on team photographs from 1909 onwards, and very much liked by everyone at St James's Park.
Brilliant. I'll post this picture of Rex on Chronicle Live's website. I wonder if this picture was taken after his ban, because he looks a bit sad in the picture. And you say he's a Great Dane, and his legs are absolutely massive. He's lying down in the picture, but he does look like a big dog. And if he wanted to get on the pitch, it would take more than someone like Peter With to tackle him.
Yeah, he certainly looks a bit of a monster, that's for certain.
Yeah, for younger fans, Peter With once tackled a dog at St James's Park, so that wasn't the first dog to get on the pitch at St James's Park. I think Rex can safely say he had that honour. So brilliant. Great way to end the show, Paul. We've chronicled the history of Newcastle United up to 1909 now. They've won 3 league titles in 5 years, but as ever, it's never perfect. There's been 3 painful FA Cup final defeats, a semi-final loss, and a quite humiliating first-round exit to some amateur opposition who had some Geordies in the team. But next week, we're going to cover 1909 to 1910, where the club can't quite avenge the Crystal Palace curse completely, but they do get their hands on the English Cup, the FA Cup, for the first time, and Paul will explain all next week. In the meantime, listeners, please subscribe to the Everything is Black and White podcast via whichever podcast platform you use. Follow Chronicle Live's Newcastle United channels on social media, We're at Chronicle NUFC on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And keep an eye out for new episodes of Chronicled, the history of Newcastle United, every week. If you have a question about Newcastle United, we have a good person here to answer. Email those questions to theEIBWpodcast@reachplc.com. We'll pick some of the best for future shows and we'll put them to Paul and hopefully he can answer them. And lastly, stay up to date with everything black and white by subscribing to our daily Newcastle United newsletter. It's free. You get a morning news roundup, an evening news roundup and breaking news as and when it happens, directly emailed to your inbox. The link, I'll put that in the show notes. Hit that, scroll down to sport, Newcastle United updates, tick the box and you'll be signed up for free. Thanks so much for listening to Chronicled, the history of Newcastle United, with me, Matt Ketchell, and Paul Joannou.